Who are the top 10 Christian novelists of all time? And today we are going to be talking about authors who not only put their faith in their work, but stylized and elevated that faith into novels that could transform the world. And so my name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we talk about the best books and authors of all time. And if you are interested in videos like this and diving deeper into transformative literature, this channel is the place for you. And so enough with introductions. Let's hop into our first novelist of the day, which is, of course, none other than Mr. Gene Wolfe, who is coming in right here. Gene Wolfe is considered one of the best fantasy authors of all time. And his Book of the New Sun series, which we'll talk about in a second, is spectacular. But something I never hear people talk about when they discuss Wolfe is his ability to write historical fiction. His Soldier of Sidon series is some of the best historical fiction ever written. And Wolfe was raised Presbyterian and eventually converted to Catholicism to, share the same faith as his wife. And when you read The Soldier of Sidon, or especially the Book of the New Sun series, there is endless Christian symbolism embedded into it. And what makes Wolfe also interesting is that there are many authors who that we won't really discuss today who are greats. Authors like Herman Melville, Cormac McCarthy, that were raised Christian but more later oriented to a more Gnostic vision of reality, which has its roots in Christianity but is kind of a breakoff. And it's tempting to do it. It's tempting as a novelist to view the world as a prison planet because tragedy makes great novels. We are tragically coded in the Western world. But Wolfe kind of innovates and remixes and moves away from this idea of Gnosticism and replaces it with something similar. A somewhat Augustine theology that believes somewhat deeply in original sin, but also has the path back with the possibility of grace. Because the problem with much of Gnostic literature, Moby Dick, is that the hope is there. Gnosis can happen, but many times the characters are failed messianic figures or never really reach any form of enlightenment or wholeness at the end of the novel. And in my opinion, when I look at Christian works, that's something that I see, because Wolfe in his works is, much more like the early Christian fathers church fathers, who thought that through humility and service and even suffering, we can move closer to the divine. Like I said, an Augustine theology. And so in all of his works, Gene Wolfe kind of relies on unreliable narration, which really serves well as a metaphor for kind of this fallen humanity that's displayed in both of these series. Because sin warps perception. St. Paul said something like, we see through a glass darkly, something like that. And there's a quote out there from Gene Wolfe that stuck with me. And he basically said that all great literature is about the fall and, of course, the redemption. And so something that Wolfe does really well is by having his characters, for instance, in the Soldier of Sidon series, kind of have this amnesia. And he does something similar in the Book of the New Sun. Some of the characters maybe don't see the divine mystery or these divine elements, but we can see them. And that transforms us. That enlightens us. And so Gene Wolfe is a top 10 Christian author. If you are into fantasy, if you're into people like, even like Neil Gaiman, that's how I got into him. Back when I was like 18, I saw that Neil Gaiman said that like Gene Wolfe and Terry Pratchett were his favorite authors. So I went and read them. I was like, who the hell are these dudes? And so Gene Wolfe has to be on this list. Gene Wolfe, also, geez, what do I have, a lisp? Also deserves credit because he worked and was a family man throughout his career and still got novels finished. And so shout out to Gene Wolfe. Next on our list is the man, myth, and legend himself, Wendel Barry. I don't think many of you guys know about Wendel Barry, but he is one of the greatest living novelists of all time and one of the most important thinkers in American history. And I have a deep respect for Wendel Barry because, much like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, who we'll maybe or maybe not talk about a little bit later, Barry had a very restrained form of Christianity. He wasn't this zealot, this radical who infused it entirely into his work and in his personal life was this proselytizing madman or preacher. Instead, Wendel Barry is probably the greatest example of an author living their Christianity, like just an actual simple Christian man who also wrote novels with Christian values, which were absolutely wonderful. Because I'm going to make a tier ranking list at some point on the most manly authors or the most masculine authors of all time. And it may surprise you, but Wendel Barry is on that list. And so a little bit of background on Barry. He is a farmer from Kentucky and is still on his farm and has been involved in the agricultural kind of scene in his local area in the Midwest for his entire life. He has been a champion for farmers and the environment, and not in the environment in the sense of we need necessarily all this renewable energy or all this stuff, but the actual environmentalism, because we have been kind of divided in our conception because of modern politics in regards to environmentalism. One side says we need to reformat the entire economy so that we don't, release greenhouse gases or whatever. And people are like, no, that's crazy. And you're right. Like, we don't need to do that immediately. And then on the other end, there's a bunch of people who view that they're superior to nature and will rip it down for just the smallest profit and all of this stuff. And it's ridiculous. And Barry, through his work, resists commercialization, abstraction, the empire. And what makes his works great is that Christianity isn't this separate thing. It isn't this revelatory symbol like what Flannry OConnor does with their stuff on baptism. It's not this allegory like, Aragorn in The Return of the King. It's none of that. Because in his stories, Christianity is the basis for what the entire community does. It's why people farm. It's why people get married. It's why people do this and that. It literally is the structure and the impetus for everyone's actions. And so many Christian authors can get caught in these allegorical tales. But in actuality, and this is something that America did so well because it happened in a modern context, that, for this small period in, the the early to mid 1900s, conscious individuals, people like Wendel Barry, who were educated and kind, were living in Christian communities without too much, craziness going on or crazy people. There's always crazy people, but not too much outside influence infiltrating it. And it worked. And, when you look back at like classic society, we were these serfs and like living as Christians, but we weren't conscious of it. We weren't reading the Bible. We weren't like actually inundated in it, in the sense of being kind of conscious acceptance. We were basically, people were forced to be Christians in many different, places in the West. And so throughout many of Barry's works, it's a town of, if you look at like his Port William stories, a town of people who've decided to be Christians and be ethical about it. He has a theology that he preaches. He doesn't preach, but he shows that has limits. He doesn't want the community to grow. He doesn't want the technocrats to save us. He doesn't want us to get new machines so that people can have more money. He knows that a proper human life, what we need, has limits, that we're going to die, that there are seasons to the year, that we have to work, that, the tech bros don't get to just have a programming job and buy up all the good real, he believes in a balanced society. And he kind of moves away because, when you look at Genesis, there is this idea of, that states that humans are above animals and insects. And that has kind of been misinterpreted forever, that we should be able to dominate it. And yes, we've attained by whatever means you think, whether it was given to us by God or just happened through evolution or whatever, higher consciousness and language. We are the superior animal. But that doesn't mean that you get to abuse that power. Just because I have a purple belt in jiu-jitsu and you've never done jiu-jitsu doesn't mean I could just come and beat your ass for fun. And the people out there who are better than me at fighting, they don't get to do that to me. But we've kind of got, just continued to create this separation. And I'm not saying we need to be vegans or anything like that, but we don't live in reciprocity, don't live in harmony with our environment. And many Christian authors have neglected this. And Barry, who, born in America, born on land, born, fishing and these types of things, really got to connect with this idea and kind of do some restoration. And another thing I like, when you look at his stories, he has characters dealing with multi-decade grapples with God. We want this Christian surrealism or this Christian ecstatic stuff where people are falling out of faith and there's the nihilists like Dostoevsky and there's all this stuff going on. But in actuality, to be a spiritual person of any faith, to actually do good, most of the time it's just humble, quiet suffering. There are no miracles. There are no raptures. It's just trying to find grace in like the small moments. And so I commend Wendel Barry. Like, honestly, you guys, it's hard. These are the people who should be our idols. We got Andrew Tate and even Jordan Peterson and all these randos. But in actuality, we still have living authors who have given us a framework to live and to feel and to think and to move away from ambition and so many other things, which I truly feel when I think of Christianity, what it's all about. What was being taught, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I think that Wendel Barry, especially for living authors, is the best embodiment of that. And so moving on, we have, of course, the Queen, Flannry OConnor, one of the best Southern Gothic and American writers of all time. And Flannry OConnor was a religious woman, even if you read her work and you're like, oh my God, this shit is crazy. And what O'Connor did, though, was realize the biblical weight in a literary sense. And she understood the Bible at a deep level. And I think because of Flannery's sickliness and her kind of introversion, that she was kind of one of these interesting savantian kind of individuals who could consume all this information and then be inundated with the modern world and be raised up with public education and these things and modern medicine, and then have the time and the space to view the Bible and these stories, and then let that kind of ruminate in her odd soul and with her kind of artistic spirit, and then let things out that are just insane. Flannry OConnor is pretty famous for inverting many Christian symbols. And if you read her novel, everyone should, it's called Why the Violent Bear It Away. You will be mind blown. I won't spoil anything here. I won't spoil anything, unless we're talking about like Lord of the Rings or something. But the novel is about baptism. Like that's kind of that's the main biblical theme that she deals with in that one. And if you guys out there have been baptized, I was baptized, assuming most of you guys were too at some point. I remember like I felt like there was a movement of energy and like there was something happening there, but I just, I was too young to really realize at the age of 8 what was properly going on. But O'Connor takes this whole thing of baptism, something we've all experienced, and writes about it in a way that you guys will be shocked about. Like literally it's shocking. Like you read it and you're seeing what she's doing with all the stories and the contrasts and new additions and then callbacks to ancient history and then the oddities and the characters, and you're watching it happen and it's Southern, which is already weird. And you're like, Jesus Christ, this lady is a genius. And it updates the concept of this ritual to the modern world, because there's this idea of the baptism that's, thousands of years old, and doesn't mean the same thing thousands of years ago that it means today. And many of us try to project that some of these older things are the exact same thing today, but in actuality, rituals and our perception of them and all these things change. And O'Connor is a visionary in kind of seeing and inverting and contemplating what baptism or mass or so many other things mean in the modern world. She's an absolute master of it. She's a dark writer for sure, but I think anyone, especially if you are a Christian, can gain a lot from her work. And it's sad that she died early, from health issues. I can only imagine what she would have produced over the last 3 or 4 decades of her life if she had that opportunity. I mean, she might be considered the greatest novelist of all time if she had that space to keep going. Of course, next we have Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. I could sit here and ramble to you guys, and I will for a second, but something I've talked about on this program before is that I've gone through lists of 100 authors. Like you can go to like the best authors of the 20th century and look at the list, and then you can look up all the authors, and I've done this before, and say, how many of these people are Christian? And what's interesting is I've done it before, and usually I get anywhere from 50 to 60%. And really, in terms of those who were practicing and actually believed it, not just kind of were raised in it, it's anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending on who you pick. And then when you look at the West and those authors, those numbers are different and a little bit lower, or actually a lot lower than the people who practice Christianity. And it's been kind of an interest for me, I should say, because the same is true over in the East, with how many great Buddhist authors are there, and Hindu authors, and Taoist authors that, write novels. And it's really hard if you are a true believer and you really have been taken by any religion to be able to take that and turn it into an allegory. People like Wolfe that we were talking about, he can add this kind of layered symbolism. O'Connor can invert it. Barry can kind of talk about the lifestyle. But to actually write allegorical fiction of any type, whether it's for religion or for some other idea, is really, really hard, and to make it good. And that's what Lewis and Tolkien did at a level that's accessible to everybody. Like I read last Christmas break, I read The Lord of the Rings again and The Hobbit. Floored, like really good. What makes that novel, that set of series really great is just the pacing. Like the pacing when you read the novels is like 10 out of 10. You're just like, Jesus Christ. Tolkien he's like, he knew what he was doing. Like just, there's a low moment, then there's a high moment. It's just like beautiful in terms of pacing, like one of the best, top 5 ever. Plus, there's all these religious allegories going on. And now in like, this sense, I've read the Lord of the Rings multiple times. I'm older now, more literary, whatever. I look at different things. But when I first read them, when I was like 11 or 12, I saw something totally different. And so it's just beautiful to see allegorical work that can be accessed at any level. I had a professor named John Bowers who wrote the book Tolkien's Lost Chaucer over here. And what was really cool was that Professor Bowers, he didn't find out about Tolkien until his like 50s. Like he'd obviously seen the movies and stuff, but he was in Oxford doing some other research and stumbled across some Tolkien stuff and then got into him and then found this lost box of Tolkien's lectures and notes on the Canterbury Tales and obviously turned it into a book. But he fell in love with him as a high-level PhD scholar who's doing great course DVDs and was like, dude, this guy's a GOAT. And, I've found that for many people. I've known many people who have gotten back into reading because of the Chronicles of Narnia or the Lord of the Rings. And, I have a 7-month-old daughter right now. And I know in a couple of years, that's what we're going to be starting on, not maybe a few, 4 or 5 years, however long, but, we're going to be reading it and thinking about it. And it's just awesome that, it just takes a skill. And what makes Lewis and Tolkien also great is their nonfiction ability to write about, criticism about other authors and then just about life in general, more on Lewis's side. It's profound, it's to be an author with any type of virtue. And if you're trying to help the world, no matter if you are religious or not, you can't just write novels. You actually have to be an individual in the world living a virtuous life and trying to help. And these two over here embody that. And so, of course, they have to make the top 10 list. And so, of course, we can't have a top 10 list without Dostoevsky. And something of interest that maybe you guys don't know about why Dostoevsky, because how did he do it? When you read many of his later novels, like The Brothers Karamazov and even like Demons and others, how does he weave in all this Christianity and all this stuff into these super complex novels and make it seem seamless and make it so revelatory? And the reason is because in 19th century, especially, 19th century Russian society, being a Christian was kind of like a poo-poo, like kind of like, okay, we're Christians, but people had started to move away, like Tolstoy's family, from actual like practice Christianity and folklore and like folklore Christianity and the Christianity of the people, and just kind of viewed it as a whatever thing. But Dostoevsky's family was not like that. They were always reading the Bible, and he was inundated from a very young age with biblical studies. Like it was actually kind of his main training. And his family owned a farm outside of Moscow that he'd spend the summers at, and his parents let him wander around and hang out with like the poor kids and the peasant serfs. And they were practicing, this more folky type of Christianity, and Dostoevsky loved it, became obsessed with it, and that carried with him. And then obviously when he was in his work camp, all he had was the Bible. And so he had been inundated for decades with Christianity, and then kind of went off on this kind of decadent lifestyle of gambling and all this other stuff. But eventually when he came back and got over his gambling addiction and wanted to just write, all of that came back. All that weight of testimony and these things just came back to him. And it's just absolutely amazing. I mean, he really is one of the best Christian authors. He's functioning at a high level. He isn't writing allegories. He's just writing smack dab novels of people just grappling with faith. And, novels like that help you, everyone, no matter if you are a Christian or you aren't, shouldn't, I think atheists, I'll just say, are kind of a joke. I think that if you don't believe in God in whatever form, you are still on tutorial island. You are still, at level 1 of the game. And that until you can start, moving toward God, energy, whatever, like that, it's not easy. It's a lifelong journey of grappling and figuring it out. But to not do that is just, I feel like, such a cop-out. And so Dostoevsky can help us in the present deal with that and grapple with these things. And so shout out to him, man. Really good stuff. I mean, I hate to kind of reduce it. Really good stuff, Dostoevsky. But he is, if we had to choose one, he's probably one of the top. So next we have another author who is still living, who is Marilyn Robinson, who is honestly kind of a go. I've only talked about her, I think, once or twice on this channel, and that was probably like 2 years ago. But her Gilead quartet is wonderful and is like a great modern kind of theological framework. Very much, I view her as, I don't like her as much as Wendel Barry because I am very sympathetic to authors that like nature and more that simplicity. But her novels, her quartet that I just mentioned, takes place in Iowa. What was going on in Iowa, man? That entire series started in the early 2000s, and we had like Slipknot out there, and like there's so many like Iowa. I don't know what's going on out there. Like I've just been like all these synchronicities of like these radical people, like radical Christians or radical musicians or authors, are like from this Iowa Midwestern area. There's just like, I don't know, there's not such a weird place. Awesome place though. And what makes Robinson really weird is that she's kind of a Calvinist, that she writes her novels through this lens of the Puritan tradition, which in a modern context is kind of weird, but it helps, with these characters who are dealing with a broken world. That's kind of one of the main ways that I think that modern Christian authors can work, is that how do we grapple with this loss of innocence? In Dostoevsky's The Idiot, I should have mentioned this. The Idiot's a great novel to read by Dostoevsky. And speaking of Dostoevsky, Marilyn Robinson, Gene Wolfe, many of these other authors, I run the most active book club in the world. We read anywhere from 6 to 10 transformative novels a month, and many of which are by authors who we were just talking about. For instance, this upcoming month, we are going to be reading the brothers Karamazov, Hemingway, Nabokov, Pynchon, Clarice Lispector, Yukio Mishima, and so many other authors. And so if you guys are interested, not just in my book club, but my literature courses, my writing courses, my own writing, I have a ton of free and paid content over on Substack. And if you don't know about Substack, Substack is where the best authors in the world are at. The best authors writing about Christianity, fiction authors, poets, political authors are all on Substack.com. And so even if you don't go there and follow me, Substack is where the best minds in the world right now when it comes to writing are publishing their stuff. And so if you want to support me for free or for a paid subscription to join the book club and get access to the courses, go down to the link down in the description below and go check it out. Like I said, I'm trying to really help people stay accountable and run book clubs that are open to anyone and everyone, no matter what your beliefs, and really just trying to help people and talk deeply about these things. And if you have something to say, my God, we're having this Brothers Karamazov meeting in a couple weeks. I would love to see you there. I'd love to hear some deep theories on that one. Alongside all the others, like we read Cormac McCarthy, who is a master of Gnostic inverted Christian symbolism. And so there we go. So back to Marilyn Robinson. I like her work because a lot of the time it feels like it's a prayer. Like this may sound weird, but that Gilead series is like, it's a letter. It's a confession. And so like much of her work is like that. And I would recommend going and checking her out. She really is an advocate for Christianity in the modern world. She doesn't stand down. She doesn't like back down. Like, at least from my knowledge, I don't keep up with her too much. From what I know about her though, and from what I've read, she kind of sticks to principles. And that's what I care about. I don't care who you are and what you're doing, but we don't have people who are activated anymore, because I would rather have one Christian who believes and is activated and is doing something with it than 100 fake ass Christians who are just going to some mega church and just like droning on and not really like living it or being activated. What we need are people of character if we want to make the world a better place. If you want to make the world a more Christian place, we need people of character to lead and do that, because right now that's not present. And one of the best ways to do that is artists, artists pushing that, because you read Marilyn Robinson, you're like, damn, this is cool. I want to know more about her. Then you're researching Calvinism and, all this other stuff. And then you slowly accumulate knowledge. And then, anyway. So next we have Graham Greene, who I've talked about once again, that many of these authors, and as we move through these ranking videos, I'll be talking about authors I don't discuss very often, but I've talked about Greene probably 3 or 4 years ago and haven't talked about him very lately. But Greene had a very good run of novels related to Christianity, and he was a Catholic himself. And Brighton Rock, The End of the Affair, The Power and the Glory are all wonderful novels. And one of the reasons I like Greene, and not many authors we've talked about have this, but many of his protagonists are really screwed up individuals, and they're not heavy. One of the problems with Dostoevsky is that he writes in the prophetic voice with like everyone, and it's just kind of like, at times. But Graham has characters that are alcoholics, abusers, adulterators, cowards, spies, and all types of sinners. But no matter where they go, much of the time, it feels like God is following them. It feels like they are contemplating their morality. And it feels good to see that. It feels good not to have someone who just has totally gone bleak and have characters who even in their darkest moments are still clinging to grace, because there's this kind of conception, I feel like, out there that when you maybe are in a rocky road in life, that suddenly you're not a Christian anymore. You don't believe these things. You're just an atheist, nihilist, all this other stuff. But in actuality, most people are just, at a very weak point in their life and have been consumed into substances or women or some of these things and are lost, but they still have this tangible connection. And Green, in my opinion, shows that better probably than anyone on this list, like how to, especially in a modern context, these characters in crisis and how they grapple with it. And so, last but not least, you guys already know who we have to talk about. And that is, of course, the man himself, Mr. Leo Tolstoy. And Tolstoy is interesting because he was a pacifist and a Christian anarchist and had very radical views. But I also feel like that's an important group in the history of Christian writers, because many of us, when we look at Christianity, I look at many of the groups, in America, I won't name them, but I'm like, okay, you guys have lost the way. This has become way too institutionalized. This has gotten way too far away from the plot and from the core teachings. And Tolstoy was seeing that happen in the, Russian Orthodox Church in the 19th century. And he had this outright hatred of it because he went through this spiritual conversion and saw that the bourgeoisie and the government were like influencing Christianity and not letting the folk Christianity and lived Christianity really blossom out. And he felt like, these churches betrayed Christ. Christ was killed by the state, by hierarchical power. And he is one of many people who, were lost in the teachings of Christ. I don't know how to say it correctly, but we've all seen it before. I mean, I've been there, and with Jesus and with other people, that you look at these teachings and we strive for purity and idealism. And if we apply it directly to a modern context, then most of the time we are acting insane. The computation in the equation, produces a crazy result with how you need to act and view the world. And most of the time it's very annoying. Funny enough, the Tolstoy crowd is one of the most annoying crowds here in the book world. So I have made now, I think, 800 videos. And, I read all the comments you guys are going to leave down there. I'm going to read. And so I have a general vibe of the type of people who come to certain types of videos, especially when I've made dozens of videos on a certain author. And I get emails about authors and stuff. And so I get these vibe checks. And the Tolstoy people so far have been the craziest. I've been harassed by the Tolstoy crowd. I've been threatened by them. Back in my old writing group, I had to throw out 2 people who were like trying to carry on Tolstoy's tradition and like shaming everyone for being sinners. Like, it was wild. And trying to make money like with their writing by selling books. Like, it's a weird group of people. But we need that sometimes. We need these geniuses who take things way too far so that we, because some of the things they are saying are true, and that's the heart of the creative genius, they pull us forward. And so these are my top 10 Christian novelists. And if you guys would like to see what we are reading in the Right Conscious Book Club for the next 3 months or in the future, right now over here, you will see a video detailing what's happening in the book club this month. And so hopefully I will see you guys over there.